business person and representatives of Hofstra's Zarb School of Business, Hofstra's Lawrence Herbert School of Communication, and the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I wish to quickly thank Assistant Dean of Outreach and Undergraduate Programs for the Hofstra School of Business, Ariella Greenbaum, and Executive Director of Hofstra's Cultural Center, Athleen Collins, for their help in making this event possible. And special thanks are also given to CCE's Graduate Assistant for Civic Literacy and On-Campus Events, Callie Wynn, as well as fellow Becca Lepresti. So now I'd like to hand things off to Bella Burckhardt, who will be introducing and moderating today's panel. Bella.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Phil, for such a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. I just want to echo his gratitude to everyone who has helped make this event happen behind the scenes. To all the professors, family, and friends who we don't have the time to name, thank you as well. I hope that this event will begin a greater conversation that can continue after we conclude. So if you're interested in continuing today's discussion, I will be providing information about how to connect with the organizations that are supporting this event. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I also want to quickly share some helpful Zoom reminders. I encourage all of you to mute yourselves so we can focus on the wonderful words that are shared today, and put any comments, affirmations, or questions for the Q&A portion in the chat. Additionally, I found that a great way to watch an event like this is to put it in speaker mode, where Zoom will show you primarily the video of the person currently talking, as opposed to this grid-like system. So if you want to do that, you can click the 3 dots in the top right corner of your screen. And now I would like to give our amazing panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Luke Kissam, who worked for the global specialty company Albemarle for a total of 17 years, 9 of which he served as CEO. So Mr. Kissam, if you'd like to introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Luke Kissam. I retired in July as the chairman, CEO, and president of Albemarle Corporation, which is a specialty chemical company. I graduated in 1986 from the Citadel as an English major. So in the line that you never know what you're going to end up doing, I was an English major that went to law school that running a specialty chemical company. So that ought to be a lesson to all y'all to begin with. Don't plan your future too far in advance, and just take opportunities as they come.
Thank you so much for being here today. Next, I'd like to introduce Jase Bernhardt, who is the director of Hofstra's Sustainability Studies program, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability. And his work aims to better communicate weather and climate hazards to the public, which you'll see by his Zoom background. So Professor Bernhardt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Isabella, and thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for being here today. Indeed, I'm a faculty member in Hofstra's Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability. My background is in meteorology and climatology, and my current work involves improving risk communication, specifically regarding weather hazards and with novel technologies such as virtual reality and video games.
Thank you as well for being here. Next, we have Robert Gutman, a professor in Hofstra's Department of Economics. His specialization in finance led to a particular interest in the emerging field of climate finance, especially in the aftermath of the Paris Climate Agreement. Professor Gutman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Professor, you're muted.
Yes, so I've been at Hofstra since 1984, but I also have been working in parallel fashion at a research lab in Paris, where I retired from last year, and where I ran a master in sustainable finance. And that has helped me kind of focus on the topic concerned today.
Thank you, Professor Gutman. Next, we have Charles Smith, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship here at Hofstra. One of his areas of research is actually the management of innovation for sustainability. So Professor Smith.
Thank you. Professor Gutman, you've been here since 1984. I started in 1986. I've never seen you before until I watched a wonderful video a few weeks ago with some of your thoughts and visions. But it's interesting that that can happen. So hello to everyone. And I'm a professor in the Department of Management Entrepreneurship. I teach sustainability. I also teach leadership, and I also teach meditation, mindfulness practice. I'm very glad to be here and take part in this. Thank you.
Thank you as well for being here. I'm so excited for Professor Smith to kind of talk about his business and meditation backgrounds coming together in questions later. Next, we have Suzanne Berman, an associate professor in Hofstra's Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations. Most recently, she has focused her experience and expertise on helping nonprofit organizations with issues of diversity outreach and other multicultural programs. Professor Berman?
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Yes, I'm a professor of public relations in the Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations in the School of Communication at Hofstra, where I teach courses in public relations, research and analytics, global communications and international public relations, corporate social responsibility, media relations, and others. In addition to my academic interest in CSR, I introduced a course to the program in corporate social responsibility, and I've written a number of articles and papers on the subject, but I also bring practical experience in the field from my life before Hofstra, both on the funding side and the grantee side. As Vice President of Public Relations at AT&T, I supported many organizations in society and environmental organizations and others. And on the nonprofit side, I was the director of PR of Central Park Conservancy and a major art museum, where I was responsible in assisting in getting funding from both government and corporations.
Thank you all for being here. As you can see, we've got an amazing panel with so much expertise. And before they start our discussion, I just want to begin by quickly setting the stage for today's event. So some of you may not know, but this year is actually the 50th anniversary of when the famous economist Milton Friedman shared an essay with the message that the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. And this idea has influenced business ever since. In honor of the anniversary, the New York Times actually asked 22 experts to respond. Many of them shared what we know today and what our panelists will help us discover as well, which is that the status quo and prioritizing only profit is no longer sustainable. So I hope that in this panel, we can explore these impacts and look forward at what we can do to mitigate them. So I'd like to start by asking you, Mr. Kissam, about your time at Albemarle and how you saw the business adapt to improve sustainability measures and how you hope to see business continue to strengthen their ethics.
Sure, thanks a lot. So Albemarle Corporation is a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. Market cap's a little over $10 billion. We're in three major business areas. One is we're the largest producer of lithium around the globe. The second one is also an element. We're the second largest producer of bromine, and we derivatize these products that go into products you use every day that make them flame retardant, that give it the energy for the electric cars and your phones. And the last one is a catalyst business that we sell to refineries so that they can squeeze more out of that barrel of oil. They can get a higher yield, more gasoline, more diesel fuel, whatever it may be, and another catalyst that removes impurities. So if you look, 50% of the revenues of Albemarle come from products that either reduce greenhouse gas emissions or promote a greater resource efficiency. But sustainability has got to be key to your strategy today if you're going to survive in the business world, particularly if you're a public company. So in 2017, we started a process where we went and looked at our strategy, where we wanted to go over the next 5 years, and did a materiality assessment where we identified the most important sustainability topics that were relevant to Albemarle's strategy and our future success as a company. Now, that assessment was from employees and leadership, but more importantly, we went to our customers. We went to our vendors. We went to our investors, and we said, tell us what is on your radar, what is most important to you. And with that feedback, we developed a sustainability framework that focused on really 4 quadrants. We published that report in 2019, and it set the baseline for what we wanted to do. And we're going to set goals and have more transparent discussions with our investors and with the public about what we do. So we broke it down into 4 buckets. The first were people in the workplace. We want to promote an inclusive and diverse workplace for all employees with a focus on safety, mutual respect, development, and their health and well-being. So, you know, we operate chemical plants. So if we make a mistake, somebody gets hurt. Nobody came to this call wanting to go home hurt, just the same way with those employees. So we've got to focus on safety. We got to focus on keeping product in the pipes so they don't get out in the environment, so that we're in compliance with regulations. We got to have an inclusive and diverse workforce. When I became CEO, we didn't have any people of color on our leadership team. We didn't have any females on our leadership team. When I retired, it was 45% were people of color and females. If you look at our board of directors, we had 1 female. If you look at our today, over 50% of our is diverse. And that's good, not because somebody outside is telling us it's good. It's good because when you have true diversity, you have people with different experiences. And when they approach a problem, they'll approach it a different way. And that different way will allow a better result. The next bucket that we have is natural resource management. That goes energy, greenhouse gas emissions, water, and minerals. Bromine and lithium are both minerals. So we have to use sustainable mining practices. We've got to take care of the slag that comes from that and how we do that to make sure that it's sustainable for the long run. We operate in the Salar de Uyuni in Chile, which is the driest place on earth. So we just had a capital project where we double the size of our ability to produce lithium. One would think we would double the amount of water we needed. We spent $100 million additional on that project to ensure that we could reuse water and conserve water because it's critical there, and on the Dead Sea where we mine bromine. So managing those natural resources in a way that's positive for the planet, yet at the same time gets the yield we need to out of them. The fourth one is community engagement. Actively collaborate and engage with those in our communities. We're not a huge company, but we are a big company presence in some very small areas of the world, the Salar de Atacama, Tyrone, Pennsylvania, Magnolia, Arkansas, places like that. So we take it very seriously how we engage there with the community. So they'll know what we're doing, as well as that we can make those communities a better place to live. We've got a foundation that we formed maybe 10 years ago, and the employees contributed to it. They decide where the gifts go locally, and we make a fairly significant contributions. I think last year it was, upwards of $20 million that we contributed in communities around the world. But that's so important. The last one is you got to have a sustainable business model. You've got to have long-term value for your stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, it's your customers, it's your vendors, it's your shareholders, it's your employees, it's the communities where you operate. You got to make money. So Friedman was right. You got to make money. If you don't make money, you're not going to be a business. That's just the way it is. So you got to make money, and you've got to make enough money to attract shareholders, to attract investors, so that you continue as a living being organism. But you need to do it in a way that's ethical and within compliance with all regulatory. So another piece of that is business ethics and regulatory compliance. We've got the Albemarle Code of Conduct that all of our employees have to agree to abide by. And we've got a set of 5 principles and values that we monitor against. When I interview people for senior leadership, you can look at a resume and tell whether somebody's got the chops. I always focus on what were their principles. Were their principles consistent with humility, with caring, with being vulnerable enough to admit when they were making a mistake? Because I believe that was more important to create the type of sustainable culture that we needed. And the last that you've got to satisfy your customers, and you got to have product quality. But the last one that is so important in a sustainable business model is innovation. At one time, Kodak had about 95% of pictures. They filed bankruptcy, a decade ago because the iPhone and the phones wiped them out. If you look at the old Palms that people used to have, those phones, everybody had one of those. Now nobody's got one. If you don't continue to innovate, if you don't continue to find a new way, products will have a life cycle. When they go out, you need to harvest that cash, invest in what's new. That's what we're doing at Albemarle. Bromine will grow like GDP grows, but it throws off great cash because we've got a low asset base. So we're harvesting the cash from bromine and we're investing in lithium because that's the next new growth for us. I think that what you're going to see from businesses aren't going to have a choice. The hedge funds, the equity funds out there are demanding that you have sustainability principles that are built into it, which is good because it is good for business. It's good for business, it's good for the environment, and it's good for all of us. But it's got to be, I think today, sustainability and a framework for sustainability has to be key to what companies are doing. And it was a whole lot different 10 years ago. The sustainability projects were really cost reduction projects. You didn't use as much energy, you saved money. Today, now people are actually spending more money on capital to allow them to have a more sustainable future going forward. So it's not going to stop, and it'll continue.
Yes, thank you so much for those words. I love that you talked about how ethics and sustainability touches every single part of business. And I saw Professor Bernhardt nodding when you were talking about your sustainable environmental factors. So I would like to turn to him and talk about the fact that in 2017, the Carbon Disclosure Project found that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions. Professor Bernhardt, how have you seen businesses impact the environment around us? Is anything currently being done to decrease these effects? And how must we be better?
Thank you, Isabella. And yes, let's talk a bit about the scientific context here surrounding some of our human impacts on environment, especially those from corporations. So here's a graphic showing where we are and where we have been regarding CO2 emissions. I know there's a lot to take in here, but we've established as scientists that the primary human driver on climate is the emissions of long-lived greenhouse gases, and CO2, carbon dioxide, is by far the highest concentration of greenhouse gas. Therefore, it's really seen as the biggest human impact on climate. So you see two lines on the graph here. It starts in the late 50s and goes through the present. The black line shows sort of the best fit overall trend in CO2 concentration, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And the red line shows the monthly trend. So just these two graphs here can tell us a lot about how we impact the climate as humans. So the black line, of course, shows a steady increase from about 310 parts per million of CO2 to about almost 420 now, only about 65 years later, not even 65 years later. Parts per million, the way to think about that is if you had a million little dots representing the volume of the atmosphere, almost 420 of them now would be carbon dioxide, a small percentage, but CO2 enhances the so-called greenhouse effect, which helps trap heat more efficiently in the lower atmosphere of the Earth and hence leads to warming. So of course, what leads to these CO2 emissions? Well, a multitude of human activities and certainly corporations, companies, businesses, whatever you want to call them, lead to a sizable amount of these emissions. And then the red line here actually gives us a more nuanced view of these changes and really further reinforces how we impact climate collectively as a society. So notice that red line has what we call a sawtooth pattern, goes up and down. So there's the overall upward trend, no doubt, but there is also a seasonal pattern where it goes up and down. That actually reflects that northern hemisphere vegetation plays a large role in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Most of the landmass in the world is in the northern hemisphere. Many of the trees and forests and trees can actually take in CO2 when they do photosynthesis, then they release it when the trees go away, aka their leaves fall during the autumn and winter. So you'll note that CO2 is the highest at the end of our winter, beginning of our spring here in the Northern Hemisphere. And then it's at a minimum in the fall around this time of year because we've had a whole summer of photosynthesis and trees taking in CO2. So why do we care? How does this connect to the business impacts? Well, it shows that throughout the supply chain, we can influence climate by emitting CO2. So of course, there's a fairly direct emissions, of course, from burning of fossil fuels, which might mean providing electricity for businesses, transportation of goods, of course. So those are the so-called direct emissions of CO2. But the red line tells us about the indirect emitters of CO2. And a big example is land use, land cover change. So for example, if you want to chop down a forest to make room for development, or maybe in part of the supply chain, you need to clear out forest land to grow certain crops that are the raw goods for your products. So in doing so, you get rid of trees that could take in the CO2, and you further lead to more CO2 getting in the environment. So it's really not just in one spot, it's throughout the life of a product, throughout the supply chain, we see impacts in the environment through these CO2 emissions. And I just have one more graphic to share here in my last minute or two, sort of further zooming in on some of the impacts on the environment. We'll get to that in a moment, it's no problem. We'll see that there's many different ways that we, again, put these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Electricity, of course, is a really big part of this, especially from the corporate perspective, all the needs for electricity in shops and, again, in factories and whatnot. And perhaps being a bit naive, it seems to me to be the proverbial win-win. As you become more sustainable, more efficient, you can cut down on costs, such as saving on electricity, saving on transportation in the supply chain and shipping out goods. So the more efficient you get, the more money you save, and the less of an impact you have on the environment through this one important influence of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll end it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing that amazing overview of how businesses impact the environment. But I also want to talk about how our economy as a whole is impacting the environment. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Gutman to discuss if he believes our current capitalist economy is truly sustainable, if there's anything in place to make it more sustainable, and if there are better alternatives. Professor Gutman?
Yes, well, the current configuration of capitalism is obviously the problem, right? We live in the age of fossil fuels, and they are responsible for a large part of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so in a way, we have to not only change business practices, starting on a micro level with individual actors, and there's a lot of developments happening in terms of moving away from shareholder value maximization as the principal and almost exclusive goal of businesses, as Friedman put in 1970, towards a much broader consideration of objectives pretty much laid out by Mr. Kissam for his company, right? We refer to this as the ESG criteria, the environmental social governance criteria. And that's a global phenomenon. So businesses are changing and they're looking for a new kind of framework of prioritizing, not forgetting to make money in the process, but realizing that following certain environmental criteria or social criteria or governance practices is actually good for profit, right? And so that to that extent also financial institutions, the asset managers, the funds, they're also pushing for the ESG. So there's already quite a lot of change going on the individual level, but this goes beyond that. It goes to also moving money out of certain brown sectors, dirty sectors, especially let's say fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas, into greener or cleaner sectors like renewable energy. But when you think of this in terms of the broad context, we're at the very beginning of a transition to a zero carbon economy, right? Or low carbon economy, because zero is typically seen in net terms. There's going to be carbon sinks. There's also going to be some carbon capture and storage technology we're going to develop. So we can allow a certain amount of emissions of greenhouse gases, maybe 10–15% of our current level. We can live with that, right? Because we can absorb that. But we need to reduce 85% of our greenhouse gas emissions, let's say within the next 30 to 40 years. And that's a revolution that requires a industrial, technological, and socio-economic revolution. And it involves not just changing the industrial matrix from certain sectors to other sectors, but also the nature of our products, right? From cars to food, and the consumers will be intensely involved because we also have a lot of indirect emissions, which we call scope 3 emissions, which are harder to measure and capture unless consumers change the way they eat, the way they travel, et cetera, right? So countries are going to go through that. And the Paris Agreement is basically a global commitment to go through this in a somewhat organized fashion, right? We call this a transition. And it involves a bunch of elements, right? And the US is the only country that's currently kind of thinking of not participating in it. And of course, that's one more reason why the current election campaign is so important, because obviously Biden has committed to going back to the Paris Agreement and Trump has committed to staying out of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is a global governance mechanism that we spent 25 years negotiating. And that is part of the problem, because the transition that we're facing to change the nature of capitalism has to be done on a global level. And it has to be done rather fast, right? I mean, we always think 30, 40 years in terms of changing the economic structure and our system. That's actually, you have to think of in terms of industrial revolutions. The first industrial revolution lasted 100 years. So we're now facing the fourth industrial revolution, and 20, 30, 40 years is a very short period of time. So we lack a certain urgency, especially in the US. I mean, I travel around the world and I noticed that the US is the country that takes it the least seriously. And that's kind of shocking to me, because it also means that we're going to start this revolution later and with less of a learning curve. We're behind already, and we wasted a lot of time in the last few years not catching up, while other countries are charging ahead, right? So the code words for this revolution is the Green New Deal, right? So the Europeans officially have launched the Green New Deal last year, and the Chinese are committing to Green New Deal as we speak. And in the US, this is the domain of what is considered to be the far left, right? But it's really an industrial policy program to transform an economy. And it's something that on the one hand costs money, of course, on the other hand also saves money. So we can't just look at this as, my God, government regulation, taxes, and so forth. That's part of a process, because you need to have signals, and signals come through prices, and prices have to be set at a certain level to affect change, right? So to the extent that we cannot do this in a pure market way, as we try to do with carbon markets, cap and trade markets, we're going to have to do it with taxes, and then we have to distribute the revenues collected from those taxes in a meaningful way to affect this transformation in practices and sectors, right? This is a huge undertaking, and it's a global thing, right? So one of the things that I'm working on personally might be of interest to you. Because of COVID, we're going through a period where the urgency is heightened, because it reminds us of that we commit environmental degradation at our own peril. There's a clear connection between climate change and the growing threat of pandemics. But at the same time, we've dramatically increased our budget deficits just to fight COVID, and therefore added to already high debt burdens, just at a time when we have to start this industrial revolution. So we need a funding mechanism. We need to have a new funding mechanism, how we globally finance this transition. That's what I'm basically working on with my colleagues in Paris.
Professor Gutman,
yes.
I thank you for sharing what you're working on now, and thank you for highlighting the fact that this is a large spread issue that we need to think about in terms of our economy. And one thing we see that you touched on is how our economy, prioritizes profits, and we're slowly transitioning to ESG criteria. I also wanted to talk about how, on a similar note of measuring success, I think we could all agree that educationally and professionally, we are taught to prioritize our careers and our productivity over other things. So I wanted to ask Professor Smith how he thinks this has impacted society and how we as individuals can find more fulfillment.
Thank you. Success. So the question of success, I looked it up this morning, etymology of the word, and it's very interesting. The first thing that came up was that success means to lead out to something new, to be led out to something new, and it reflects change. And as reflecting change, it's by itself, there's nothing wrong with success. Success is a wonderful thing. But success that's measured the way that is exclusively through the way Milton Friedman saw it at that time. And it's possible that we could say yes and to Milton Friedman now, that yes, people need to have success, corporations need to have success. As Luke said, you go out of business if you don't make a profit. You have to make a profit. You have to be sustainable on a monetary level. But success for an individual, even in the past 20 years, has the young people today, 40% of the young people don't have any interest in monetary success. They're more interested in making sure the planet stays, that we're still alive, that we still have a home for our children, right? So the definitions of success have changed a great deal. So what do we need to really feel ourselves being led to some place where we're happy, to an existence that is not going towards more disease, towards destroying our planet like day by day? And if anybody isn't convinced, just David Attenborough's latest film, it's on Netflix. I think that could convince just about anyone that we're really in a very serious crisis, and we all have to change. And I don't want to be apostle, I don't know the right word, but I really dislike hearing people standing up and saying, you know, we're all doing this wrong. And I don't think that's where the answer is. I think the answer is that we have to first get the view of the whole system and see where we interact with that, and then have to see what does it take for us individually to do it right. And I think it comes down, and I will speak as a sustainability professor who, in teaching the material, had to really start asking myself, well, how much am I differentiating between what I need and what I want? You know, how many computers do I need? I tended to be toward, well, I need my computer for my work, so I can have 2 or 3, you know, that's okay. And I know that's not right. How many times do I have to change a cell phone? Those things. But anyway, that to get off the soapbox, they aren't things that are about greed so much, but there are things about making sure I'm doing the right things to make myself happy. And that brings us into like the human level. How do we take care of ourselves? Do I take care of myself physically? Do I take care of my neighbors, my family, my friends? How am I working with the world? There's a lot of amazing research about the brain being able to reorganize itself and to affirm positive states of mind instead of negative. So the negative states of mind are always going to find the villains and who to blame for these problems. The positive states of mind are going to say, okay, what can I do? How can I best be a part of you know, like working? I love to hear what Luke just said. He worked to develop a good company, and okay, they're selling lithium and bromine, but they might have in certain contexts they're seen as pollutants. but we can't shift the world into a whole new regimen without a transition period. So we have to do what we do. And even Patagonia, they say, you know, we are not a sustainable company. There isn't a sustainable company on the planet, but we're moving that way. That's all we can do. And we have to learn to be easeful about it so that it's not like killing ourselves to be more sustainable. If we do that, we're going to end up going and buying too many new computers, put it that way.
That was so wonderful. I think if anyone knows me personally, they know that I love Patagonia, learning about their business model. I can hear my roommate laughing behind me because she knows it's true. And we've seen companies like Patagonia with current events stepping up to the plate and changing their practices. Things like they've helped over 500 companies commit to giving their employees time off to vote. So with that in mind, current events such as COVID-19, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the climate crisis, this upcoming election, because consumers, especially in our young generation as college students, are starting to turn to businesses for action on these social justice issues. And we've seen companies like Patagonia that are really creating that change. And then we've also seen companies that there's public discourse surrounding their lack of action. So I wanted to turn it to Professor Berman, who can discuss what consumers are beginning to expect of companies and how these businesses need to start adapting.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say that consumers are not beginning to expect things. They've expected things for decades. I think what we're seeing now is with the advent of more and more technology and accessibility to more information, what consumers are beginning to expect is more transparency and more disclosure. And consumers want to know more about many of the things we heard Luke speak about. They want to hear more about businesses' values, their programs, their processes, and you know what their impact is on society and the planet. This is why you see things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, which has been around, by the way, for a decade, almost a decade or more. And the Carbon Disclosure Project is where thousands of companies are disclosing their waste and their water usage and other things through a very detailed disclosure. And companies have been doing that for a while. And companies are also now expected to reduce, as someone said, I believe Professor Gutman said, according to the Paris Agreement. So we are seeing companies do quite a bit. And that's as it relates to the planet. It's also true of businesses' impact on community and society. While part of the need is like what I said before, transparency and disclosure, I think another expectation or another reason we're seeing companies step up is the failure of government to attend to these concerns. When you have a government not stepping, or when you have a government that's stepping away from the environment, for environment protection, stepping away from peaceful protest, stepping away from providing a safety net during a global pandemic, you see the public looking somewhere. They have to look somewhere. So they're looking to the second most important sector, the business sector. And I would argue that the business sector actually is stepping up. And so you see, for instance, when you look at something like COVID, with such confusion and chaos coming from the government side, you see businesses saying, okay, well, we have to do something to support our employees, to protect our employees, to protect our consumers, because without consumers, without employees, we don't have business. So we're going to support frontline workers. We're going to support the World Health Organization through funds and grants. We're going to support the CDC. And we've seen this over the COVID crisis, companies stepping up and doing this. Feeding America, big support going to Feeding America. With the void from government, businesses had to step in. And again, if you look towards other issues like Black Lives Matter, for example, when you see the government failing to take a stand and say, hey, the police are killing Black people, companies again are stepping up and saying, we have a diverse workforce that we need to support. We have a diverse group of consumers, and we see corporations starting to fund continuing a long history of support of organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, and others in trying to make a change and to support the diverse workforce and consumers that they have and that they want to continue to attract. Having said all this, I do think that companies are still pretty cautious. They have a strategic, disciplined approach to their support because they do have a very diverse group of publics that they have to try not to alienate any of them. So we do see them. Yes, there are some companies that are wholeheartedly taking a stand one way or the other, but most companies, I would say, are doing a cautious, disciplined approach because, as was said earlier, they're not a nonprofit. They do have to make money. Without being profitable, they're not going to be able to be helpful.
Thank you for sharing those words. And I think it's also interesting to note that often with increased ethics and sustainability practice, you see an increase in profits. And we've seen that in Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's recently with these responses to the events that are occurring currently. I want to thank you for sharing. Now we're going to move into the Q&A section. So again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I've started to collect these questions. And the first one that I'm going to ask, I'll direct at Professor Bernhardt. Most people blame the meat industry for the most harmful emissions. Do you believe this to be true?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly there's been some back and forth in the scientific literature in recent years. And of course, then moving into the more mainstream media as well about the role of animal agriculture. And a few studies had suggested at least that it is sort of the leading cause, but most other findings have sort of stepped that back a little bit and said it's certainly in there as a significant contributor to environmental degradation and fossil fuel emissions, but perhaps not the leading cause. But one quick point on sort of the detrimental impacts is it's sort of a doubling the land use. For example, for grazing cattle, not only do you have to have the cattle grazing on grass, you also have to grow crops for them to eat. So those crops could directly be eaten by people, but instead that land is going to growing crops that then the cattle consume. So it's certainly not efficient if you think about it that way, not to mention all the water used and other aspects like that. So certainly it's very impactful on the environment, maybe not quite number one though.
Thank you for sharing that. And Professor Gutman, a question for you. Do you think that our direction towards extreme capitalism has a role to play in our poor environmental control?
Yes, of course. I don't know exactly what is meant by extreme capitalism, but if we mean by that the excessive emphasis on shareholder value maximization and short-term thinking, then yes. And I think that part of the challenge is to change capitalism into a more humane, stakeholder-oriented, and environmentally embedded system, right? And I think that's the challenge we're facing with this transition to a zero-carbon economy.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And let's see. Another question for Mr. Kissam is if you could elaborate on the environmental and climate effects of producing bromine and other related chemicals.
Yeah, so if you think about lithium, lithium's it's the element, and in the Salar de Atacama, where we find it, we have to have electricity to pump it out of the ground. It's in shallow brine. So what are we doing? It's the high desert. So we're putting in solar panels so that all of our pumping the water there will be done through solar panels to reduce our need for electricity. In addition to that, you've got to evaporate the water from that. And in the Salar de Atacama, we're lucky because the sun does all that work. It takes 18 months, but the sun does it. But now you've got a salt that you need to convert and what's needed to go in the cathode of that battery. And that takes energy to power it, to put in, to convert the sulfate to the lithium carbonate or the lithium hydroxide. So we've got to manage what energy we're using there in order to do it. It's the same thing with bromine. There are pumps that we pump it out of shallow brines in Arkansas that requires energy for us to send it over to our plant to hit it with the chlorine that releases that bromine from the brine and allows us to derivatize it. So in any chemical process, you're using energy. And so you've got to manage that. And what we're trying to do is, in a business that's growing like lithium, I don't think the right way to look at it is what is your total greenhouse gas emissions, or what is your total energy usage. It's, are you getting more efficient per unit produced of lithium? Because if you're going to have more electric cars, you're going to have to produce more lithium. So how much energy are you using per unit? And we have got to continue to reduce that and reduce that. We've got to continue to reduce the water usage. We've got to continue to be able to mine less minerals in order to get to that lithium. So it's cost, but it's also the right thing to do. And it's basic, it's required. I mean, that's what the communities require for us to do. That's what our customers want us to do, because they want us to reduce their costs. So it all fits together. You know, I'd caution everybody. One of the things that one of the professors said is, it's a process. In 30 years, you're cramming it in. And I think what you're really doing is having these types of discussions are the right thing to do. But it's not a right answer and it's not a wrong answer. It's, we can do this, but this is what it means. Now, are you willing to accept that consequence, or this is what it means? With climate change, as far as I'm concerned, there's no question we got to change. It's clear you've got climate change. It's clear we're causing it. When you talk about the land, I was at Monsanto for years. And when we started the genetically modified food, the fact of the matter is you've got less farmable land. You've got a higher population you're trying to feed, so you need to increase yield. Are you gonna accept genetically modified organisms or not? What are you gonna do? It shows a higher yield with genetically modified organisms. It comes with consequences that have to be managed, and not all the risks are always known up front, and nothing is risk-free. And so the discussions that y'all are having, I just encourage you to keep having them, and to listen when you're talking to, because every direction there's unintended consequences that we have to collaborate to solve.
I love that you talked about how it's a process. We're always working to get better. And I also will include that here in the next question about this attendee was talking about how sustainable products and the sustainable product market is a great way to give us as consumers our purchasing power. And I will turn this over to both Professor Berman and Professor Smith about how we can go about creating a sustainable products market, and if we can benefit that market through innovation or government stimulation. How do you see that market growing? I'll pass it to Professor Berman first, and then Professor Smith.
I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of social enterprises. So businesses that are specifically designed to address some of these needs. So the fact that it's no longer just the purview of the nonprofit world, but actually you can make money through solving the world's problems is hopefully a direction that can answer this problem of sustainable products, merging the two of entrepreneurial spirit and social need.
Thank you. I completely agree, Professor Smith.
Can I? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, yes. The one thing I'd say is I think we ought to consider the program itself. So in other words, if you look at the adding ethanol to gasoline, okay, it sounds green, it sounds sustainable. It's far from it. What it is the corn lobby got Congress to pass this, but it hadn't actually. You probably are using more fossil fuels to create the corn to put in the ethanol to save the gas. So we really got to think through it, and don't let this. That was one of the questions you talked about greenwashing. Don't be greenwashed. Look behind the data to be sure you have the real data that's driving the sustainability, not just some hocus pocus.
Go ahead, Professor Smith.
Yes, I feel that taking from my students, my MBA students, we don't have to do much to convince them about our need to make sure our products are sustainable. They, as consumers, a lot of them have young kids. When they see a course about sustainability and realize the situation we're in, I find many of them rise up and say, you know, I've got to live differently, and I'm going to not shop for this or that or whatever. Any company with any brains will be aware of what's happening in terms of the consciousness changing in our world. So I think that's really, it's really a natural thing that happens when, and actually I feel like people today, because of everything that we're going through, are like facing truths that we haven't had to face when we could get in the car and escape from home or whatever. You know, we have to learn to be happy with what we have, and to really be, to realize that that doesn't just mean being happy with what we're doing, but also seeing how we're affecting our neighbors, and making sure that our products don't have a dangerous side effect to the degree that we can. And you know, the consequence, what we really need is vision. We need, and this is what Professor Gutman's video I recommend, because it comes out of the understanding that if we don't look ahead and have a vision of the world we want, we're going to not have it. We're going to have just continual, you know, the Buddhists call it samsara. You go through the same thing over and over again until you start to see, wait a minute, we can shape the world the way we want it. So just add that.
I love what you said about that each of us can step away from this and create change as students, as consumers, as professionals. And before we leave today, I'd like to end with a question that sort of resonates in that area. And I'll just have each of you share a quick sentence about it in our last 4 or 5 minutes. As we know, buying sustainable goods is a privilege of time, it's a privilege of money, it's a privilege of opportunity. And as college students, especially, you, Professor Smith, highlighted that we want to make a difference, but sometimes don't have the money to do so through purchasing goods. So I'd like to ask each of you, what are different ways to create a difference? And I will start with Mr. Kissam again, just a quick sentence before we end about that.
Yeah, well, just remember, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Do what you can. Do what's within your reach. You got a voice, raise it. You have purchasing power. Make those decisions. If you got if you're buying water bottles, plastic water bottles, don't buy them. Buy a metal one and refill it. Okay, but do what you can. Do locally, and remember, it's the pursuit of grace, not the attainment of it, that'll get you there. So just keep working at it.
I really love that sentiment. And Professor Bernhardt, what would you like to add?
Sure, just to build up what Luke was saying, those are all excellent points. It's the personal behavior choices, just even small things. For example, thinking about transit and trying to walk or bike or take public transit, especially when it's safer again, versus driving all the time, can certainly have a nice impact in supporting different contexts and corporations that are in favor of that.
Thank you so much. Professor Gutman?
Yeah, I mean, I can only add on to that, right? Luckily, you're young, so you have a lot of space and scope for change, but it's ultimately the young generation that's going to live through this and also transform this. And it requires education and information and communication and talking about it and making your choices. And we have seen already with COVID how radically we can change behavior in a hurry when we have to. So there's reason for optimism here. But it ultimately is also really an important question of how we organize society. There's in particular the role of cooperation between government, business, and stakeholders of business, including consumers, as well as this question of global governance, right? Because it's a global problem we're facing, and we need to think globally and act locally.
Thank you. I will pass it off to Professor Smith.
So I feel like the key is to have the right intention, to really know where you want to go and what you know, and really make it a devotional act to bring change that's for the better for our world. That's really, and you know, if you have that, it doesn't matter if you work it, doesn't matter where you work. I mean, you might move to another place, but you might work at Exxon, and you might have the right intention to make some change there, get somebody to think differently. But anyway, I feel intention makes a big difference. How we decide we're going to spend our day and the rest of our life.
I love that sentiment, and I hope each of you after this reflects on those intentions. Last but definitely not least, Professor Berman, your thoughts.
Well, I think students can do so much, and of course they're the answer to our future, but in small ways they can start with volunteering with organizations that handle issues of concern to them and in their community. So volunteering is very important. They can advocate for causes through social media. I think young people are very good at that, so they certainly can advocate. That doesn't take much effort. They can give small amounts. I know money is a hardship, but they certainly, nonprofits are welcoming. The smallest donation is helpful. And of course, they could commit to doing more when they're older. And I think that falls really into the intent that Professor Smith was talking about. And of course, on the sustainability, they can do small things like drive less, use less water, buy green products, just waste less in general, boycott companies that don't share their values. And mostly, I think they can read up on issues and educate themselves. I think someone else, I think Professor Gutman mentioned the importance of educating oneself on the important issues. Of course, vote, be engaged citizens.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today. I hope that you leave this panel thinking more about how you define success and thinking about how we're the future of the business world, of all careers really. So as we leave Hofstra, the impact that we want to have on the world. Thank you again to our panelists for sharing their wisdom and their expertise, and to the Center for Civic Engagement and the Zarb School for co-sponsoring and co-partnering on this event. That concludes our time for today, but I hope you enjoyed. And again, please keep this conversation going afterwards and refer to the resources in the chat to stay involved. Thank you all so much.